Welcome, folks. Thanks for coming to the State of the Net panel. I think the title of this, and forgive me because I have not prepared 1 second for this besides putting it all together. As a moderator, I am not where I should be. However, I believe the title is something like Tech Policy Literacy, What Level of Knowledge Does a Policymaker Need? And frankly, pretty much my entire professional career, I was recruited by the person in the next room, Deirdre Mulligan, who's speaking on the AI panel, to do this job. And the core of it was the Congressional Internet Caucus work on the Hill. And let me, if I can give you just a nugget of historical reference points here. Back in I hate to say back in the day, because back in like 1995, there was a senator from Nebraska. His name was Senator Exxon. And the internet was a couple of years old, the World Wide Web. The Mosaic browser was in wide use. Mark Andreessen was thinking about making a public company called Netscape. And Senator Exxon walked around the Senate floor with a binder of images, printout of images, and he said to his fellow senators, do you know what the internet is? You know what the World Wide Web is? No members had websites. They didn't use email. Senator Kennedy might have had a website, but it was like, the address, the URL was mit.edu//S-Kennedy. And that was his website, his congressional website. Nobody had it, nobody knew what it was. And he said, Senator, have you seen the World Wide Web? And he opened up his binder, and of course it is printouts of naked people doing all sorts of things in the state of undress. And he basically went around all the senators and said, we need to stop this. This is going to be this World Wide Web thing is just pornography. And it's basically just penthouse on these electronic devices that the military made and operate. By the time he was done, if you asked any one of those 100 senators, have you seen the World Wide Web? They would have said, yes. Senator Exxon's binder. And that was the level of tech policy literacy in 1996 when they passed the Communications Decency Act. So, as a baseline, what level of tech policy literacy do we need members of Congress and staff to get to make sound decisions in this area? I hear it all the time. Look, why can't we get members to be computer science majors? Why can't we get more technologists in Congress? And I think the question we have today, an honest question about how does this all work? How do members legislate? How do they intake information? And how do they come to the best possible decision with the amount of information necessary? So that's what we wanted to do today, and we had three or four different perspectives on that topic. I am totally unprepared, so if I say anything, I'll be just devil's advocate, or I'll be a total Luddite. So I'm perfectly suited to be a moderator for this. So let me introduce the folks that we have. Next to me is Daniel Schuman, who's the Policy Director for Demand Progress. He leads their efforts on accountability and transparency. Will Rinehart is the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum, and Will and I go back a long way. Stacey Hutchinson, who we really appreciate coming. Stacey is with the newly named Monument Advocacy. And she's a principal there. She's had stints working for members of Congress, and she knows this stuff, how this stuff works in and out from that perspective in the private sector now. And then Lorelei Kelly. And Lorelei is a senior fellow and director at the Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University. She leads the Resilient Democracy effort there. So that's our panel. Since I'm not prepared, I'm going to expect a lot of questions from you, the audience, and we'll chew on them a bit. Is that a good setup? And not too many minutes. So let me, if I can, just start perhaps with, I did note that in 1996 when the Communications Decency Act passed, literally no United States senator had any idea what the internet was. And that's why the Congressional Internet Caucus was created, to be like, okay, this internet thing has potential, maybe you shouldn't kill it. It was a modest proposal. I will say this, 2 years later, the Telecom Act of 96 is really not, it has a little bit of life left in it, but it's not that much. 2 years later, the members of Congress passed the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. They created Thomas in that time frame. There seemed to be a lot of early work despite a total lack of understanding of the internet. There hasn't been a tremendous amount since, but things can get done in a total vacuum of knowledge. But that's not ideal, is it? So let me just go to Stacey first and say, Stacey, you have worked with members on the inside, trying to get them staffed up, trying to get them to understand the issue. What role, how do members kind of internalize this information when they're going from, today it's like Congressman Latta probably has given 3 speeches since he gave this one this morning. He's probably on his 3rd speech of the day, and he's probably talking about some obscure tax proposal. So how do members actually get to the level of knowledge where the people in state of the net, and this is like kind of the cathedral of internet policy, we would love them to know everything, right? But what's realistic, and how do they do this?
They do it by staff, right? So every congressional office, House and Senate, has a number of different staff that are experts on these different issues. And I use air quotes to say experts because usually a legislative assistant or legislative director will have 2 or 3 issues at a minimum in their portfolio, but the members themselves really rely on the staff to get up to speed on issues when they need to be up to speed on the issues, right? So if we're talking about the National Defense Reauthorization, maybe they're not super focused on data privacy that week. But when data privacy is up and they're going through it in committee, the members are reading a lot of different reports, a lot of different perspectives from industry, from different industry groups, from governments, GDPR, for instance, from foreign governments. They'll really go to school and take that to task so that they can understand what they're going to be talking about, whether it's during a speech or in a committee hearing. And to take that a step further, I think obviously the staff is getting their information, yes, from reading a ton, whether it's online or CRS reports or American Action Forum reports, but they also rely heavily on industry to come in, the businesses that are actually putting these technologies into practice and putting these regulations and laws to work. And how that's affecting their business, how that's affecting the technology that they're running is all very important. And I think that role is really beholden to the industry and the representatives to come and educate the staff members and, de facto, the members of Congress themselves.
If you were to say, when they reach out, are they reaching out to, from in the private sector, are they reaching out to folks in the policy apparatus here in Washington, or are they going to other places? They go to different sources. They go to their local state university. Where do they go for information?
I hope both, frankly. I mean, I hope that, I worked for a member from Minnesota, for instance, and he was big on the medical device tax. And so when we talked medical device tax, we were going to, industry groups that were based here in Washington. We were going to 3M, for instance, that was based, in his home district in Minneapolis. So, when it comes to technology, I hope that the members of Congress and their staffs are relying on their districts and their states for information. Obviously, that's, their constituencies and that's who they represent, but also, the broader swath of the subject matter experts that actually lie in this town, but also in Silicon Valley and Seattle and St. Louis and Atlanta and everywhere in between.
So Lorelei, you've done a lot of work on trying to funnel expertise from specific districts to the members' intake of information and decision making. I think one thing that people that don't understand civics is that we live in a representational democracy, and members of Congress come from different places, and their constituencies they don't look necessarily, unless you're Eleanor Holmes Norton, like Washington, D.C.
That's for sure. Can people hear me? I'm going to... I came to D.C. from Silicon Valley, and it just occurred to me when I got interested in technology, the lexicon itself, which you just mentioned, is huge. Just think about it. In California, a hacker is an artist. In D.C. policy circles, it's often a word for a criminal. In California, disruption is a business plan. In D.C., it's a whole category of national security threats. In California, a carrier is Verizon, and in D.C., it's a big landing strip in the ocean for Navy jets. I've actually had these conversations in between California and D.C. I think what we're seeing now, which is a huge opportunity, is with this last election, you've got members of Congress who are newly elected who sort of hit escape velocity as soon as they got into Congress. They're revolutionizing Instagram and bringing the American public along with civics in a way that possibly only the musical Hamilton has done for us as a nation. But you've also got members in there who still think that the tab key is a miracle instead of tapping spacebar 5 times. So we've got a chance now here in DC, and I think that this community is extremely important right now, and I'm assuming most people here are around DC, because proximity will always be most important for Congress, because politics is about relationships that will leverage technology. It's not going to be the technology that leverages the relationships. And so I would just put that out there as the chance we have right now. There's a new Special Select Committee on Modernization. This is huge. The president signed the Open Government Data Act into law 2 weeks ago. This is huge. How do we bring the first branch of government along with that? And finally, Congress has agreed to bring back a partial technology capacity at Government Accountability Office. These 3 things I always view sort of like the trifecta of bringing Congress into the 21st century. So that's something we can talk about.
Okay, and just keying off of that, like Danielle and Will, there seems to be, a lot of these conversations say we can solve these problems if we just build more kind of infrastructure and institutions. We've gone through a period recently where Congress seems to not want to build a lot of institutions and bureaucracy and those type of capacity. Let's be honest, like it's the Congress heretofore for the last several years has been said, well, big government, as Reagan would say, is the problem. So let's not make more government. But is there things that Congress can do to kind of better their intake on information and make more sound decisions? And what level of tech literacy do they need to get to?
Want me to start?
Yeah, please.
So first of all, just make this easy. How many people in this room have worked on the Hill? Would you just raise your hand? All right, this is helping. How many people in this room are lawyers or lobbyists? All right, so this is. I'm both, right? I'm a lawyer and a lobbyist, and I've worked on the Hill, and I've worked at CRS and the whole thing. So I mean, so just a couple points to start. There are 1,000 fewer House committee staff now than there was 25 years ago. There's 2,000 fewer people at the Government Accountability Office. There's 100 fewer people at the Congressional Research Service, where I used to work. There's about a 20% decrease on the Senate side as well. New York Times had a story this weekend where they talk about the career paths where people get to Congress. Most of them are lawyers and lobbyists or business folks. I think there's 8 members of Congress who have a STEM background. So that gives you sort of a perspective in terms of what's been happening institutionally. And one of the things that happened institutionally almost 20 years ago now was the demise of the Office of Technology Assessment, which is one of the things that I think that we'll be talking about. And like Lorelei hit the Open Government Data Act, I lobbied on that legislation. Select Congress, I call it the Fixed Congress Committee. Like this is an opportunity to change things. It's not the only place. But for many years, Congress was advised by an authoritative, independent agency called the Office of Technology Assessment. And its purpose was to help make Congress smarter about technology. Now, there are other folks who have this responsibility. Of course, the committees have this responsibility through their staff, and individual members have these these capacities as well. But OTA's job was sort of analogous to CRS, which was, so CRS provides timely advice on matters of importance before Congress. GAO provides sort of watchdogging investigations. They do sort of in-depth research. And OTA creates sort of long-form investigations where they brought in all the stakeholders, assess the issues, and provide a menu of options for policyholders. And when I testified before Ledge Branch of Probst last year, one of the striking things that came out was this is the most requested thing that the Democratic members of the House had asked for. 100 and something members of the House had put in their appropriations requests to restore funding for OTA. So it's worth remembering why it was killed. It was killed for 2 reasons. One was the idea that, well, government needs to be smaller, so we're going to start at home. Well, I can tell you that, that has happened, and then in spades, the House of Representatives, in terms of its funding, is 10% below 2010 levels. Like, Congress is, appreciably smaller, but the executive branch is appreciably larger. So the ability to oversee all the things that are happening, Congress is like sort of the oxygen in the room for them, their expertise. Like, all that has diminished as a consequence. And one of those pieces, of course, is OTA. So the theory is bring it back in some fashion. Some folks simply want to, like balloon, blow back up the thing that was demolished. Oh, I should mention, the other reason it was killed off was to empower industry and to weaken independent congressional expertise. Like, that was not an incidental effect. That was the point, right? There were concerns that these were truth tellers. They would say things like global warming is real and the Laffer curve doesn't work. And people didn't like this. This also killed off a division of CRS, by the way. There's a reason there's no economics department. It was killed off because they would say things like the Laffer curve is not real. And members of Congress didn't like the idea of having these types of truth tellers. So the idea is to have, again, technologists, experts, people who can provide neutral, independent advice to help Congress understand these issues so that when you look at internet policy, which was something that was funded through DARPA, that Congress, Al Gore went around saying he invented the internet. Well, he didn't invent it, but he was responsible for creating it in large respect by putting the funding towards it. Like a lot of these innovations are driven through congressional attention, and OTA is something that can help sort of create the roadmap or identify the landscape so that members can better understand the types of things that are the challenges that will be facing them. Sorry, that was very long, but hopefully that helps.
Bill, if you have any perspective on the...
Yeah, so I mean, I guess with my feeling about, I know we have been talking a lot about OTA, I've written a lot about it, Daniel's obviously written a lot about it as well. To me it seems like, and I think actually you laid out some of the major problems here, that OTA really is the fall of OTA I think is a symptom, not necessarily itself a cause. There has been a clear decline in the number of staff that you've seen at the congressional level. You've had, especially like Senator Lee talking about trying to reinvigorate the congressional Congress as being kind of the leader in this space. But at the same time, you've seen a decline in the number of staff. It's not necessarily a winning political argument to say that I need more staff and I need to spend more money. So there is also this tension I think that we need to be very cognizant of, that politically that the optics of these sorts of things of even embedding more intelligence in Congress may seem like a good thing to us, but optically, politically, it's not really the best winning argument. People just, I've heard a lot of this from politicians even at the local level that, saying that we need more support and we need more staff is just, it's a tough sell for a lot of people, and you're not going to be able to sell this to local constituencies. Now, that isn't to say that we don't need expertise. I'm just saying that the pressures are also, I think, very, very important. The one thing I had mentioned about this, which, we talk about 1996, and I think it's kind of an interesting, it's really an interesting time, because 1996, and there's really been some very interesting work done on this, seems to be the point at which congressional offices themselves sort of switched and changed what their actual kind of functions actually seem to be. That when we think about congressional offices now and committee staff, there's a lot of communication staff, because you're constantly trying to deal with, the 24-hour news cycle. The fun thing that this is a small side note, the 24-hour news cycle used to mean that you had 24 hours to figure out what was going on before you had to deal with the news cycle, which when I started learning about that, I was like, wait a second, that's not how I know it. But that's what we've gone to. The media landscape has changed the demands of what a political office needs to output. And part of that output is communication, and what that communication necessarily means, and I hope we'll get a little bit into this, is that some of the things that you're going to be doing will be optically driven. And I think the big highlight for me is that, for example, we had a recent hearing about Google, and there was a lot of criticism about the members and the members using this time to effectively say, why are my Google rankings so low? Or, why is it that I don't seem to be appearing very high in Google rankings? Well, it's because the individuals at the end of the day are very driven by this sort of news cycle. So I think that at least, and I hope we can get a little bit more into this, I think we need to parse out these questions of policy from broader questions about politics. We care a lot about policy, and we should care about policy, but we have to be understanding that there is a political environment that you have to survive here.
Yeah, so Stacey, that's a good question about the hearings, right? Like, how do members get to Washington? Like, this is a bit of a they get elected, right? And we also have to realize that there are two people. They're making sound policy. They're trying to make sound policy, but they also they want to be elected, but they're constituents. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And touching on the hearings, everybody likes to beat up on the Zuckerberg Facebook hearings, a year or two ago? I don't remember how long ago that was now. But it wasn't all that fair, right? Because I'm sure that the members, while they, sounded like they didn't know anything about how Facebook worked or made money, I think that they actually truly did. And I think that if it wasn't for the, 5-minute time limits that they had while asking the questions and responding to the answers, there would have been a lot more information kind of brought out, and I think there would have been a lot more knowledge shown from the senators and congressmen alike. So, while I think it's hilarious, and I also like to make fun of it, it's not all that fair. But I will go back quickly to a story. When I first started at CTEC at the chamber, we got called by a subcommittee on ed workforce And they said, we really need you all to come in and brief us because our members think that the sharing economy is Uber and Lyft, and that's it. And so that was kind of a great use case of why an industry group like CTEC at the Chamber, right, which had a bunch of different members in the technology space and the gig economy space and the sharing economy space, could kind of go in and literally educate, right? Like, this is the perspective of Postmates, this is the perspective of Uber, this is the perspective of Lyft, et cetera. And not political, not biased, but just this is the facts, this is how we operate, this is what we're doing, kind of thing, and to kind of educate in a safe space too, to a certain extent. But yeah, sorry to answer your question. They are. I mean, the politics matters, right? They've got to get reelected. The constituents matter. They care about what their members of Congress are talking about and taking up issue-wise, and what level of expertise they have on different issues when it matters. So yeah, there are a lot of pressures.
Yeah, and we come from, we have Amazon HQ 2 coming here soon across the street there. We live in a very tech environment. Like, DC is a pretty tech environment, Northern Virginia, Maryland, and we don't realize that some members come from places where they don't see a lot of tech in their daily lives besides the phones that they're using. It's really not a core driver of jobs in their district. Jobs and constituents are the things that members care about, number one. And the trick is to get them caring about this industry. And in fairness to them, and let's just kind of look at it. How many in the internet industry, there is no internet industry. The internet's kind of a platform that is subsuming all other industries. But if you were in mining, those issues don't change that much over time. Insurance doesn't change that much over time. It's glacial change, from the marketplace compared to what I've experienced in my job since I took this job like 20 years ago. It's just shocking. We just went to school this morning on antitrust, right? I haven't had to do antitrust since the Microsoft days when I was in law school. So, if say the net, this is the 15th year. So 2004, there was no antitrust at State of the Net in 2004. The internet companies didn't, most industries just dismissed the internet and internet companies. So things change really rapidly. And I think it's really difficult for members, particularly in this space, to really start understanding these things. And the privacy issue right now is fractally complex, way more complex than we thought it was, even 15 years ago. So Lorelei, going back to the question, at those hearings with the Zuckerberg hearings and the Google CEO, obviously the format's kind of tricky for members to actually make any good points or actually get to any answers. But the question is, were there any members that didn't have enough resources at that hearing to get to understand what that issue was?
I think that's probably for sure. I think probably for a member of Congress, the most important thing is being able to ask good questions, topical questions, as much as providing expert answers. My sense, my project at Congress is on crowdsourcing expert capacity in Congress. Essentially, what I've discovered in working in 3 different districts, one of them's rural, one of them's suburban, and one of them's urban, is that we need to build a trust engine for Congress. We call this building a Congress stack. And the idea is, where can you go back to already trusted infrastructure for sharing information? Because one thing Congress has lost in the last 20 years is its knowledge commons. The House and Senate used to share far more sort of synopses or staff or convening mechanisms. You notice in the hearings when the House and Senate did theirs together, that was a better hearing. It was a far more rich set of questions and answers because you just had more computer science expertise among the members. So why don't every subcommittee have a Stack Exchange, a Q&A site before a season of hearings? I actually just pitched this to TechCrunch for the Committee on Modernization, which is create a curated mechanism that's trusted and in the realm of journalism that's also creates sort of a supply chain of information into policy that is auditable, that creates more discourse, that is in the formative stages of policy, so it's not such a third rail in DC. So there's this whole realm of ideas that I think Congress used to generate when it was more sort of an analog system in general. We work more with the House than the Senate because the House is like the risk aggregator for the Senate on tech. I think the Senate, I think it's waiting for its entire fleet of messenger pigeons to die before it moves to flares. Maybe we'll get and then email. So the Senate is just a harder on the communications front. But it's also really important because every senator represents an entire state, and ideally would be able to regenerate a shared knowledge system at the state level, now with tech and data allowing for synchronous and asynchronous information. Cybersecurity is going to remain extremely important. The decentralized web is going to be part of this. But what we need right now, and this is what I've found with every member I work with, they're all trying something new. They're all trying to figure out how to bridge this time and space disruption. In Arkansas, Wi-Fi is defeated by a rainstorm and a tin roof. I'm from a farm in northern New Mexico. I just got snowed in for a week. Actually we couldn't even get down the hill because there's no plowing. It takes 3 hours to watch anything on cable, so I completely understand. This is a lot of Americans. And I would argue that this sort of red-blue urban-rural divide, that our overcoming that antagonism that is metastasizing with social media and with the sort of monetized memes and the kind of money that has weaponized information that should be protected for policy purposes, that the solution to that is coming back together as a nation, is how we configure this next iteration of our tech and data.
That's a big, how do we control disinformation, amplification?
All of it is
we have 2 more
huge, right?
panels on that later today.
Okay, yeah. But I'd be happy to give examples. Like, we're working on a digital field hearing. Everything I do is already within the rules of Congress. So we're not trying to build sort of an exoskeleton, but actually working within the institution to see what it's done in its past and what you could build on that just uses new tools. Like what a stack exchange for the subcommittees. In the 70s, there was something called a subcommittee Bill of Rights, where they wrote down what they would like to be doing as the subject matter expertise layer of Congress. Think of, we call it the Congress stack. But there's no reason now that there can't be secure, trusted, public interest information feeds into subcommittees, into committees. The other part of this that's really important is the distortion of policymaking, where the authorization process, which is the sort of nerdy information trial balloon idea place, has just moved into the appropriations process, and they're not equipped with the staff to do it.
So I did promise we go to, because I'm so poorly prepared, we go to audience questions early, so get them ready. Let me give Will and Daniel a chance to kind of key off of what Stacey and Lorelei said.
Can I go first?
No, go ahead.
So I actually, to bore you guys with like crazy details, so I put out a study on Friday where I was looking at House committees. Adjusted for inflation, House committees are $100 million less than they were about 10 years ago. So down by about a quarter. So when Lorelei is talking about like all these different interesting ways of approaching things, you have to realize that they're doing this with such a smaller piece of the pie. And one thing that I think is worth looking at is having like real world comparators. So let's look at the legislative branch versus the executive branch. A lot of what Congress has created has been in response to not trusting the executive branch. So you've got the American Law Division of CRS, where I used to work, because you don't trust the lawyers at OLC, and you've got CBO because you don't trust OMB. Like this, and you've got the President's Science Advisory Board and I'm forgetting the name of it now. They didn't staff anybody up until like last week. They just appointed the science. I can't think of it. OSCP, right? And OTA was its equivalent, or the Science and Technology Committee, which was run by a guy who didn't believe in global warming. So that's the analogs that we're dealing with. There has been, I think, some really interesting things that are happening right now. So we're seeing rhetorical shifts. So for a long time, like the political point that Will was raising was a real good one. We shouldn't pay these congressional staff anything, blah, 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 right? And that goes on and on. And then you see some members start to say things like, people should be paid a living wage, and that they shouldn't have to work 2 jobs. When you look at the average congressional staffer, and I've looked at this, in the House side, so they're there for a year or two, and they're in their 20s. And there's nothing wrong with being in your 20s. I remember them fondly. It was a while ago. But you should have people who are, who have done this for a while, as well as people who are looking at it with fresh eyes. In the Senate, slightly more experienced, but not a whole lot better. CRS is churning staff out. The government shutdown is going to, it changes the calculus for the way a lot of staff look at what their career path is. So all of these things sort of factor into what it means Yeah, what it means for Congress to be competent.
Daniel, you're impressed.
So the hope is
By
that.
the way,
So
we
there's.
did look at,
Yeah.
in addition to staffing,
Yeah.
we did look, the last Congress was in session about like 18% less. They were here in the city 18% less than they had been, 8 years prior.
So the good news, and there is good news. One is that the House rules themselves have changed significantly. The Democrats, when they came in, as did the Republicans 10 years ago when they came in, have modernized the way it functions. And there is real desire. We saw this through the last legislature probes process that the Republicans led. We're going to see it again with the Democrat led. There is a real desire to put money back into this. So there is a desire to address some of the underlying capacity questions and address some of the underlying technology questions. So there is that kind of sea change that's taking place.
And as devil's advocate, and I'll hand that off to Will, there's an argument to be said that more staff, more resources don't necessarily, contribute to better policymaking. There's a theory out there. And other countries are run like that. Like Australia is it's basically run by autocrats or technocrats. I'm not quite sure what the word is. And people take issue with their decisions on these issues. The same in the European Commission. So Will, does it all just mean we need more time here in Washington and more staff and more resources, or?
No, so I think these highlight two real problems here. So one thing that I would say is that, before the expertise question, I get to that, the one thing I think that Congress actually could do is conduct surveys of their own staff like the rest of the federal agencies do. There's this federal agency survey that anyone that's worked in a executive level agency typically has to take. So something along those lines that's consistent, that's just figuring out what people actually need, the kind of resources they need, how they're feeling about their jobs. It just very minimal HR work actually probably just needs to be done at a very base level. Then we can figure out, about the salary problems that you're clearly talking about. That's also another issue I've heard from staff members. I think I probably would be working on the Hill if it weren't for the fact that it's actually just quite difficult to live in this city and to be at the level that I would probably be at. But more about this expertise issue, I think that we need to think critically about what the outputs of this kind of expertise process is actually going to look like. What are the goals that we're trying to maximize? Are we just trying to maximize more legislation? That, to me, isn't necessarily the best thing. The fact that Congress is hamstrung means that they're not doing as much, which means they're not doing as many good things, but they're also not doing as many bad things. So the question I think that we really do need to be thinking about critically is what is the output? The EU, it has a lot of expertise. They don't have the kind of external nonprofit policymaking relationships that we typically have here in DC. They're far more internalized. You have, if you're typically an economist or somebody who's worked in technology, there's a much higher likelihood that you'll be able to go and work in Brussels. The output of that are some very, in some ways, very worrying pieces of legislation, I would say. And then, in fact, we do know that experts are pretty bad at predicting what's going to happen in the future. We also know that generally experts, at least in expert areas, typically aren't that good about predicting what really should be the best course. But that's not to say anything about experts, not to say that they're any worse than anyone else. It's just that it's really, really hard to predict what we necessarily need in the future, how the laws, even if we do have a law or a proposed law, how that's really going to impact a larger society, once it goes to the courts and how it's interpreted, what that actually means. So there's a lot of nuance here that yes, I do think we should be talking about expertise, but the question is where does that expertise get inputted and where does it fall within the larger decision-making processes? And to me, that's a really, really difficult question to begin to answer.
Daniel wants a quick response. Then there's like 5, 7, there's tons of people in the audience that are eminently more qualified to moderate.
Yes.
So let's go to some questions in the audience after Daniel's quick response.
Yeah, so just two things. One is that most of the G15 countries have an OTA-like entity that's actually modeled after our OTA, which is kind of interesting. And the other is that, I think that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but people aren't entitled to their own facts. That there are some things that are fundamentally a baseline about the world. This isn't funny, but this was a joke that we had at CRS is about, like you would write these reports and you'd have to say things on one hand, people say the world is round, and on the other hand, people say the world is flat, right? Like there are some types of arguments that there is value of having experts who can say things like, there's value in having an expert panel. Like, we didn't go and grab 5 people off the street to come up here. Like, there is utility in well, maybe we did, I don't know. But I don't think so. I mean, there is value in having expert advice. That's the value of having industry come because they know their industry. That's the value of having folks, So while, there can be an anti-expert argument made, so long as we live in a democratic system and we don't abolish Congress, there will be a need for Congress to have people to rely on to figure out what's going on.
I've not seen any recent proposals to abolishing Congress.
I've got some stuff for you.
I'm sure we have a bunch of questions for the speakers. I know that Rick Lane certainly does, and other experts like, yes, please.
What role do you think that the lack of use in technology plays? So I work at Dropbox, and when you guys talk to people about Dropbox, many of them have never even heard of it because of the constraints of what they're allowed to use while working on the Hill. So what do you think of that? And how do you solve for that problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question because just my personal understanding, like I have difficulty grasping concepts unless I've actually had experience with them. Other people are different, so how would you respond to that question? It's a good one.
So there's 2 things. One is that many of these things are being used inside Congress, but they're not allowed to be. So many congressional offices have Slack. Many congressional offices have Dropbox. Many of them use like Google Forms when you submit your appropriations requests. Like these aren't folks in like a bubble. I mean the members it's a little bit different, right? So there was the WikiLeaks leak a couple years ago for the email addresses for members, and like it was this like astonishingly high number of people had AOL email addresses or didn't have an email address at all. So like there's definitely like disparities that mirror sort of background, but a lot of the constraints in terms of being familiar with this stuff has to do with Congress is one of the most attacked institutions from like foreign threats. The underlying technological infrastructure behind there has been underinvested for like 20 or 30 years. Like the information revolution largely has not come to the way they run their operations. And the consequence of that means that if you want to see how an amendment changes a bill in real time, you have to get a person to do it by hand. Like there are those real world consequences.
Well, let me go to Stacey because Stacey, you've been in the room with members and with leaders, and you're trying to get across a concept, and you're trying to get a decision to be made, and like, what is that? Is there a disconnect there? Is that a challenge that they're not actually the member doesn't have familiarity with that technology? So you have to refer to metaphor. So you say, well, Congressman, it's like a.
Sure, of course. But I would also, kind of flip that on its head a little bit and say, is a member of Congress supposed to understand how a pacemaker works if they don't have one, right? Are they supposed to understand how a medical device works if they don't have one? So yes, it is up to the staff. Hopefully, if there's something that, is before Congress that has to do with Dropbox, we will have heard from, someone from Dropbox or their representatives. To kind of be able to understand where they're coming from. I would argue, maybe I'm naive, but I would argue that most of the staff that's dealing with technology policy would have at least heard of Dropbox, if not used it many times. I know I've been using it for years. But it is up to the staff to use analogies. It is up to the staff to kind of liken it to different things. But also I think it's up to the members. I would hope, again, maybe naive, that they would take an interest and maybe seek it out a little bit, right? Like go read about it, go pull up Dropbox.com and see how it works and see how some use cases would be applied to them, and not just necessarily in their congressional office, but how other constituents are using that service or how other businesses in their district are also using it.
Can I just follow up on one more thing? At the beginning, I said that Congressman Latta has probably already given 3 other speeches today in the time that he gave this morning on different topics that are equally complex. What is the day of the life of a member of Congress when they fly in? They flew in last night or this morning, and then they fly out again on maybe Friday or something. What is a day like for them? And how much time do they have to ingest information and play around with Dropbox?
Let me answer a little bit different way. So have you ever seen a briefing book for a member of Congress or their Dropbox perhaps with all their documents for the next day or the next week? If you see a member of Congress on an airplane, no doubt she is reading through 90, 100 pages worth of speeches, of letters to constituents, of bill text, of background information. So that prep work, and it's not necessarily, it shouldn't ever be done the night before, right? It's usually done weeks in advance. It's usually done on the plane ride to DC or home from DC for any constituent work they've got to do. But, I mean, yes, there is very little time to actually get in the weeds on anything on a normal day, but they make time for it after hours. They make time for it, on airplanes, on train rides, in between meetings, etc. So,
Other questions? Peter. Oh, please, yeah. And Peter, can you just identify yourself?
Oh, yeah, sorry. My name is Peter Vertelling. I'm working for the European Union delegation here in Washington. Maybe the panel can tell me a bit more how they see the role of the higher education and universities, both in providing staffers, training them. Is an engineering or law degree enough? Or what do you think about that? And on the other side, the university providing science and scientific output. Is this something which should flow in the process? Thank you.
So yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, why don't members look at their state university system as a great resource on these issues?
Yeah.
One of the first layers of this Congress stack that I look at in districts is the role of land-grant and public university community colleges. The reason this is so important is that the original purpose of the land-grant system was to bring in rural America into the best of modern knowledge. Why don't we have, and they created something called the Cooperative Extension Program, which is the actual staff mechanism in thousands of counties across the United States to share that information and implement it in pilots with farmers, for example. Why don't we have a digital extension service right now? Why haven't we repurposed the public and land-grant system for that? One of the reasons it's so important for this layer of our trust engine for Congress, for policymaking, is that these schools have a much easier time integrating with and accessing Congress than anybody else. I know this because going from Georgetown, I talked to the ethics committee about projects I'm doing, and they say, you can't do that, not at Georgetown. Georgetown's a private entity. It can't have access in the same way. The other entity that could do this are called the Federal Depository Libraries. Many schools have them. Georgetown has one, so that's the way I could work as a faculty member there. But that's the best question you could ask. I mean, in the 90s, I think it was the Kellogg Commission, they did a whole revamp of thinking about the public and land-grant system. And I can send this to you. It's like a scanned PDF online. If you want to Google it, I can send it to you, or I'll tweet it. It is a really wonderful set of recommendations for the public university system in this country to become this public-serving, rapid response knowledge system. And the beauty of it for Congress is that it creates a competitive political constituency for high-quality knowledge. You saw this happen with crowdsourcing or citizen science, by the way, with the Flint, Michigan water crisis. That was Virginia Tech partnering with families in Flint to come up with affiliated data that was structured in a way that was compelling to Congress. I think that how do we decentralize the knowledge functions of Congress? And this is like a new division of labor for civics in the United States. Like, why aren't citizens already being included and asked to contribute more than just showing up every couple of years to vote? Like, that's a really interesting question to ask, too, for citizens in the United States.
Yeah, so just three very quick things. Sorry, one is that this is a role for some of these support offices and agencies to play. So GAO and CRS should, but don't really look at this type of stuff. The second is that academics tend to operate on an academic cycle, and Congress operates on a Congress cycle, so they don't really communicate very well together, and oftentimes academia doesn't know how to write things in a way that is actually useful for Congress. And we see, like the UK has different, like the Technology Assessment Office, they're actually just recently put out a study where they talk about how they're actually making use of the academic expertise that is arising throughout the UK. So this type of thing can be done, but it's not being done well right now, at least in the US.
I have a question from Rick Lane.
Can I actually?
Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, just one small comment. This is actually one of my major issues, and one of the reasons why when I was originally in academia, I kind of left it was because of this exact problem, at least at the congressional level. So at a congressional level, I think that there is at least a problem kind of educational inputs in the way that you mentioned. At the state level, I don't necessarily agree with that, because I my father worked for the Institute for Government and Public Affairs in Illinois, and this was a local. It was supported by the University of Illinois, which I'm originally from Illinois, and it was a resource that he used pretty extensively. There was a whole bunch of professors who worked there, and you see this in a lot of different states as well. You see the extension services that have already been mentioned also be providing expertise on agricultural problems within Illinois that I know specifically. But you see this at the state level. I think it's just far easier to do it because of a locality problem, to be very honest. Now, Georgetown provides some very, good professors who are doing research in this space. You have also GMU has kind of a function along these lines. GW, the local and American University as well, and Catholic, all those are actually very well. They have a lot of really, really great professors in Maryland that are interested in these issues. And in fact, some of my professors that I worked with at graduate level came to Maryland because they wanted to be closer to politics. So the local schools, I think, actually do a pretty good job of this. The question is there expertise that's located elsewhere that could be integrated within this kind of larger knowledge system? That I think is still very much just a local knowledge problem, and there's perhaps ways that we can kind of mitigate that and deal with it. But at the end of the day, I do think that at least at the state level, it's a pretty good. I think it's pretty good, all things considered. And at the federal level here, we have a lot of expertise that's located here, and it's often talked about or talked to.
This time next year, you'll be sitting in where you are right now is
Yeah.
going to be Johns Hopkins University.
Yep.
Rick Lane, CEO of Iggy Ventures. I was the first chamber person hired by Tom Donahue to do tech policy specifically back in '99. So you can imagine what it was like back then and talk to chamber members. But Stacey, you hit the nail right on the head about expertise. Congress passes laws, but not every member of Congress is a lawyer. Congress passes a lot of policy that they are not experts in or didn't work for. And I think sometimes there's this mindset within the tech community that if you're only as smart as us, you understand how stupid you are, and we're going to do memes and point out how stupid you are, which is, I think, causing a lot of the backlash to the tech industry, because these are policy issues. You have a policy of cafe standards. I don't have to understand how a car works to say we want to have a policy of this type of mileage per gallon, or we want to do X, Y, and Z on policy issues. So I think too often the tech people focus too much on the tech side of it, understanding that there are complexities of privacy and cybersecurity and encryption. But at the same time, what members of Congress are trying to do is to set policies and then frame and figure out if the technology will work. We've gotten too much in the head, far ahead, where it's the legislating by code instead of legislating by policy and legislating by law. And I'm wondering if you think that tech backlash is really caused by some of the memes that we all like to laugh at, but members and staffers are really working hard on these policy issues, know these issues, they're solid on the issues, and I'm sure they don't appreciate the type of response they get from Silicon Valley and the tech community on Facebook and Instagram and every place else.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think, we could have a whole nother panel on techlash alone, because I think that's a major problem. Mike, thanks. I think that's a major problem for technology companies, because there are a million gazillion benefits that technology is playing, to our society and to every one of us sitting in this room. And so I think we need to really be playing up those benefits and drafting and instituting policy that's going to encourage those benefits, right? And, yes, government is there and plays a role and needs to, set some standards and some regulations when it's applicable, but not always, right? We don't necessarily need to have a regulation just because something happened in the data sphere, et cetera. And so yeah, I totally agree. And I think to Will's part about the 24-hour news cycle, it has done a detriment, I think, to policymakers and to Congress overall. Unfortunately, there are benefits to super ongoing news, but there's also the downside too. Having 24 hours to learn about something and respond as a previous communication staffer on the Hill would have been heaven. So. But yeah, I think you're exactly right, and it's business too, right? We talk about technology as as these platforms and these things that nobody understands, but at the end of the day, they are businesses and they affect businesses overall, whether we're talking about Google or Dropbox or AIG or Johns Hopkins University, for instance. So yeah.
If I can interject, I do think that I've talked to a lot of people. If you really want, if your job and your main passion is to make sure you have sound policy making coming down from Capitol Hill, you want sound decisions on technology policy coming down from Capitol Hill, I assure you, making fun of members of Congress on Twitter is not the way to do that. It's counterproductive. That's a fact. So anyway, but if your job is to do other things and you want to just tweet that stuff out and make fun of members of Congress, that's fine. But people whose job it is to assure sound policymaking, that doesn't help. Yes?
We've been referring to tech expertise in a sort of monolithic way. It broke down a little bit in a more nuanced way with the question about academia as a source of tech expertise. But my impression is that a lot of times when people refer to outside tech industry expertise, they mean professional lobbyists hired by large tech companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera. And as someone who works in the tech industry, but not as a lobbyist, not as a CEO of a large corporation, but as someone who has hundreds of friends and colleagues who are professional programmers, product managers, documentation writers, et cetera, who all have a wealth of expertise and interest and opinion on these political questions, I think some of the making fun that you see is a form of frustration because they don't see themselves, or we don't see ourselves as having clear paths to influence Congress or the owners of the corporations that are purporting to speak for the entire tech industry. So I'm curious about what role you see for congressional staff or these institutions in providing a better pipeline to, I guess, everyday tech workers.
I can tell you what one of the things that one of the other layers of this Congress stack I go to in districts is makerspaces and tech hubs. And sometimes they're called accelerators. To your point, the local academia, like Arkansas State in Jonesboro, very connected to the member of Congress, lots of times because the member is an alum, for one thing. But that makerspace, which is innovative, it's collaborative, there's no civics built into it. It's detached from that. But when I go to these interviews in these makerspaces or tech accelerators and bring it up, they would love to be included as sort of a local surge team for technical questions to venues for field hearings. So I think that, again, there's a way to, as we rebuild our democratic institutions, to make sure that it's decentralized, secure, and public serving. And we can do it now. I mean, that's the beauty of this, is that we actually have the raw material to do this now. So I would argue, members didn't even realize that there's a hackerlab.com, there's a map online that maps all the hacker spaces across the United States. A really helpful tool would be that then map that onto congressional districts, or somehow have meetups. I always look at tech and data meetups in districts to see like what's going on in Nashville and go to those. And they don't think of offering their expertise to members. And so I think it's a two-way, like there's this desperate desire to help and there's a sense of urgency, but it's finding each other now. But you're exactly right. Those should be the local surge teams.
I would add to that too. I know that this is putting the onus a lot on the programmers and the engineers, but if those people who had an interest in going to their member of Congress or any member of Congress and educating them, like go to their government affairs people and say, hey, can I come to meetings with you? I have something to add, or maybe they would be interested in my perspective, or can I send a letter on behalf of our company that, says X, Y, and Z? I think that level of engagement at a company perspective would be awesome, and I think it would really translate to some of the knowledge base that the staffers and the members of Congress have too. And I realize that that's not their job, and that's asking them to do something added, but maybe it would make the whole process more collaborative too.
I would just say, finally, it's useful to have people who are like you on the other side, right? So, like, Travis Moore is running Tech Congress, which is an effort to get people who are technologists to go and work for Congress. Congress itself isn't funded well enough to pay folks the salaries that they need, as you know. But people who work for Congress and help members think through the different issue sets, ideally should have some background or expertise in the matters in which they're working. And people will often, if Congress is staffed largely by lawyers, then we're going to think in the box of lawyers. And if you want to have people who have different backgrounds who are able to talk and understand the different ways to engage with people outside.
That applause Oscars where they play the music and they tell you you're done. But basically, I'm sorry. You had a lot of people had questions. I apologize. I need to ask you all a favor. In about 5 minutes, down in the main plenary room, we have Congressman Jim Langevin and CEO Corey Thomas from Rapid 7 to do a pre-lunch keynote. So if we could all go down there and actually for the pre-lunch keynote, and then we can have lunch. But before that, I want to thank this amazing panel who basically showed up. I emailed them on Friday basically to show up.
I told you
for
so.
this.
Streets.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's
It was okay.